including Venezuela, Cuba, Zimbabwe, and so on. How does one explain that if you're not seeking to prosecute a new Cold War? The burden for that is on Washington, in fact. At the same time, at the United Nations, a group of friends in defense of the UN Charter produced a declaration of great strength, forward-looking document about defending a charter, the most valid piece of paper on the planet, because this is a piece of paper, the charter, which is signed by most of the countries in the world, and that's significant. So a group of friends to defend the UN Charter produces a declaration which I thought was very important and counterpoint to the kind of new Cold War that we see taking place. Please go to the nocoldwar.org website, read the statement we have, sign the statement, join us as we try to bring peace and sanity into the world. This webinar will be in two panels. The first panel is called The Problems of a Unipolar World System. I'm so glad to have as the chair of that panel, Kate Hudson, who is, as I said, with the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. Kate, all yours now.
Thanks very much indeed, Vijay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this first panel, The Problems of a Unipolar World System. Speaking as a peace movement activist, it seems to me that a lot of the problems we face today are about the US wanting to retain a unipolar world and trying to do that through military might. Just last week, we saw the latest attempt. Vijay has just mentioned AUKUS, the announcement of a new military pact between the US, UK, and Australia. Here in Britain, in the peace movement, we see this as a dangerous escalation in the West's ongoing hostility to China. And of course, it also introduces the risk of nuclear proliferation into the region. I'm sure we'll hear about this and much more from our expert panel today. So over to our speakers. First of all, it's a very great pleasure to welcome Ajamu Baraka. Ajamu is the national organizer and spokesperson for the Black Alliance for Peace, and he serves on the US Peace Council. He was also the 2016 Green Party candidate for Vice President of the United States. Ajamu, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kate. And thank the organizers for giving me an opportunity to share some comments on this very, very important webinar as we are struggling to try to make sense of the world today and preparing ourselves for what we know are the necessary changes that we have to bring about in order for us to survive as a species. I'm going to, as Vijay shared, we have just a few minutes, but I guess I'm going to proceed in almost a selfish kind of way in terms of raising some questions for myself that perhaps others may have as we address this issue of the possibility of a multipolar world. The title of this webinar and discussion is important on many, many levels. But it almost assumes something different is emerging, a dialectical development producing an inevitable qualitative outcome that only begs the question of what is the nature of this new development. But I think the real purpose of this webinar is not to assume anything, but to, in fact, pose questions associated with what some are calling a multipolarity. And so that is what I will center my short comments on, raising the questions that I have, and hopefully I will gain for myself and maybe others some degree of theoretical clarity coming out of this discussion. So to do this, I'm going to tackle this in two ways. First, with my questions, and then suggesting the kind of politics and ideological targets that a world moving toward multipolarity will have to consider, and all within my 7-minute framework. Let me begin. It is clear that there is a movement away from the unipolar world dominated by the US over the last 30 years. a domination that I would argue called the US ruling class unprepared with the counter-revolution and subsequent disintegration of the Soviet state and system. The immaturity of US leaders not being ready for a global hegemony completely botched their period of unraveled hegemony. I won't go into all of the critical mistakes made here in this conversation, but I think we all have a sense of some of those mistakes, including the, from their point of view, the disastrous notion that the US could fight two simultaneous global military conflicts. However, despite the many mistakes and counterproductive policies, I begin with the assumption that I'm sure everyone might agree with. The global economic and political system is still one that is characterized by continued hegemony of the capitalist market system and the political hegemony of the US and Western interests. So the questions for me begin with, what kind of multipolarity? Multipolarity in terms of centers of state power within the global capitalist system, or a multipolarity in which states, classes are moving or have moved outside of the dimensions of global capital. If the frame is multipolarity between states or a cluster of states within the context of global capital, then how real is concept of multipolarity? If issue of class and hegemony of global Western finance and corporate power is abstracted from this equation. If, for example, it is true, as many have argued, that the US nation state is in decline, does decline of the relative power of the US nation state automatically translate into the decline of US and Western capital? Still, I believe, under the hegemony of US finance capital. It is quite clear that despite the hype of an ascendant China, that the international financial system is still controlled by US-based finance capital, with the dollar still the world's reserve currency and its control over the major public and private lending institutions, including the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and its control of the system of international payments known as SWIFT. The US finance capital still has disproportionate control and its power is still unchallenged. My friend Roger Harris points out in a recent article how that grip of control is manifest. He points out that the share of world currency reserves has been holding but steady fluctuating between 60 and 65% range. That is the world currency held in US dollars. That amounts to about 7 trillion, almost 60% of international currency reserves. So what this means is that 90% of the nations who engage in import and exports require the use of the dollar, of the euro, or the currencies of other imperial states. Therefore, is it not the nation state competitive frame and anachronistic and distorting framework for describing the reality of global capitalist motion? Is not the real nature of the struggle between nation states or classes and fractions of classes the real struggle? If there is multipolarity in a global capitalist system, would not the inherent internal contradictions of capitalism inevitably lead to conflict between classes, nations, peoples, and states? We already see this occurring, the sharpening conflict of interest between the US and the European bourgeoisie. We see that Europe is going to have to be forced to engage in some kind of balancing between the US and China. It's very difficult for European bourgeoisie to draw a strict line of demarcation between the US and Western capital and China. That line of demarcation is almost impossible to hold with the new realities. We see this with the UK, US, Australia pact that was a reflection of this attempt by the US to try to garner its hegemony using military might. But also we see it with the contradictions between the US and European capital around the issue of Iran, Nord Stream 2, the Trump shakedown of NATO, all reflect, in my opinion, the growing realization that self-interest of US capital was and is in contradiction with the interests of European capital. But if it is multipolarity within the context of ongoing hegemony of global capital system, of the global capitalist system.
Could you wind up now, please, Ajamu?
Oh my goodness.
Time flies.
What then are the forms of oppositional politics? The forms of oppositional politics, and I go right to the end then, is that for those of us in the West, the logic of capitalist competition operating through nation states suggests that our focus has to be on building independent mass-based political opposition that centers the struggle for socialist transformation. Issues that we must include have to include issues of peace and support for struggles for national liberation. And so, as I close, while we are moving toward competing centers of state power, the ultimate center of power still has to be with the various peoples and nations organizing against global capital and for socialism. That goal has to be constantly reinforced and must, my friends, drive our politics. Thank you.
Absolutely. And thanks very much indeed for that. Can I just ask the speakers, if you find during your contribution that your internet connection is unstable, do feel free just to turn the video off, because that'll help with the sound, but I'll leave that to you. Okay, so turning to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Madison Tang. Madison is from Code Pink in the USA and leads the Code Pink Women for Peace, China is Not Our Enemy campaign. Madison, welcome.
Thank you so much, Kate. Thank you to No Cold War and to Vijay and Tricontinental. Really honored to be amongst this esteemed panel. And can I just say, Ajamu Baraka's been one of my personal revolutionary heroes for a long time now. So definitely honored to be here and appreciate being here. I'm going to share some slides. Moment. So I am with Code Pink, and I'm coordinating the China is Not Our Enemy campaign. So I wanted to talk about how a unipolar, capitalist, imperialist, and neoliberal world order is much more a adversary or enemy to the people and planet and our survival than the People's Republic of China. You might have seen this. You can see it in Global Times. And this is a illustration of the Last Supper with the G7 leaders. There's a lot of little symbolism in it. So I recommend taking a closer look sometime if you get a chance. Just wanted to show this and represent this Chinese illustrator. And I'm going to start with some visual examples of impacts of US unipolar order, as well as hegemony on the rest of the world. So unipolar world order dominated by global North nations, and in particular US and NATO hegemony. It looks like the safety, the sovereignty, the development, the possibilities, and the survival of global South nations being dependent upon the will of the global North, relations of domination and submission. And so this is starting with military presence abroad for the United States military. Rather than spreading, quote, democracy, which is what we hear from our leaders in the US, really what we're doing is exporting violence. And this is the buildup of the war on China, including NATO bases, missiles, nuclear submarines, showcasing the false framing of a power dynamic in which China is the main aggressor, especially militarily, but on all fronts of the hybrid war. And I want to just keep going to just a general list of US interventions since World War II. We just had the Pentagon budget go through $780 billion this week, which is record high. It's the highest Pentagon budget we've ever had in the US after a $21 trillion global war on terror, quote. And just within Biden's first 100 days of office, we know he's done airstrikes on Somalia, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan. Even though he said at the UN that US military power must be our tool of last resort, actions speak louder than words, and covert wars are still wars. Hybrid wars are still wars. They still count. In addition, we have coerced military and security alliances, which I'll show some visuals of in a little bit. And this is kind of looking towards an alternative, flipping the script a little. By 2020, as this map shows, while the US has continued war profiteering, dropping bombs, immiserating global South nations, China has been building roads for trade, for anti-colonial, anti-imperialist solidarity, ushering in a new era of multilateral trade, development, progress scientifically, cultural exchange, trade as an alternative based on principles of cooperation, interdependence, mutual understanding and trust, mutual benefit and development. So going back to more impacts of this world order currently that we're arguably in transition, I think we'll get different perspectives today on that, which will be great to hear. The global north being responsible for 92% of emissions. The US would be 40% of the climate catastrophe, the EU 29%. And a lot of this does relate to militarism. Unfortunately, militarism, emissions from our military in the US are not counted in national emissions because of the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, which the US very much pushed so that military emissions would not be counted for any country. But our carbon footprint for the US military is larger than that of 140 other countries put together. So this study is through the Lancet Planetary Health, talking about the atmospheric colonization that has been inflicted on the global South through resource extraction, militarism, colonization, racial capitalism, causing climate damages like droughts, floods, famines, sea level rises, et cetera, that global South nations are bearing the brunt of, dealing with the harm disproportionately. This is a map of sanctions. It's not comprehensive, but it shows 39 countries in red. The US is sanctioning roughly a third of the world's population. And we know this is an element of hybrid warfare. It counts as economic warfare, and the impact is drastic, tens of thousands of deaths across the world, primarily women, children, and the elderly who cannot get access to essential medicines and foods because of these policies. And then looking a little bit at oil, these blue arrows show the proportional tonnage of petroleum movement. We can see that oil shipments mainly start from the Middle East and Venezuela, going towards Europe and the US as main destination markets, very much tied up in the wars that we are waging from the US. This is a little about vaccine apartheid, which I'm sure many are aware of. Global North, rich countries will get vaccines before the South, especially with the TRIPS waiver not being supported by all nations. And that's going to lead to newer variants, newer, more deadly variants. It's going to lead to the whole human race not being able to fight the pandemic. I'm going to skip through a little bit quicker. So this is the supporters and opponents of the TRIPS waiver, and we can see these blocks through these maps, opposing blocks. Nations that have recognized Palestine, nations who are in favor of the blockade in Cuba. It's just the US and Israel. This is just corruptions perceptions index from a study in Germany, which shows some bias in how the narrative is controlled around which countries are deemed the most corrupt. So today, from the US context, these are just some of the things we're seeing on the ground today. Late stage capitalism, it's pretty grim, which is to say that people in the US are suffering. People in the global South are suffering the most, but everyone is suffering as a result of US imperialism and capitalism.
Can you wind up soon, please, Madison? Thank you.
Yes. Just looking at the normalization of mass death here, reaching the amount of deaths in the AIDS crisis, more deaths than the plague in 1918. And then looking at threat inflation. So these are just from the Pentagon Budget proposal and the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, which is inside the Pentagon Budget and is primarily directed at China. The $780 billion Pentagon budget is primarily justified by the inflated false threat of China. I'll skip through this. This is just kind of how the US is seeking to control power in the Asia Pacific. And just wanted to highlight this is an action that we are very much trying to get signatures delivered on in the next week for the Eagle Act in Congress, one of many bills that Congress is trying to push through rapidly, bipartisan, to build its hybrid war on China. And so you can see some of our other actions here, trying to get PBS to stop censoring China's alleviation of poverty, our national campaign to cut the Pentagon, and some webinars coming up. So thank you so much.
Thanks very much indeed. That's incredibly interesting and informative. You may see that there are some requests in the chat that you share your slides in some way. So I don't know if you have them available on a website. If so, could you put the link there? I know certainly I'll be very keen to use them myself or draw on that information. So thanks very much indeed for that. Our next speaker is Professor Issa Shivji. Professor Shivji is Emeritus Professor at the University of Dar es Salaam. He was formerly the Mwalimu Julius Nyerere University Professor in Pan-African Studies there and the Director of the Nyerere Research Center. He's also one of the authors of the 3-volume biography of Julius Nyerere. Professor Shivji, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the organizers for giving me this opportunity, particularly the opportunity to meet all comrades. And I would like to say that I associate myself almost completely with Ajamu's presentation. But unlike him, he started with class, state, and financial capitalism. I want to start with a complaint. Maybe that's typically African. And my complaint is that much of the discourse on multipolarity suffers from a huge blind spot. And this is the conspicuous absence of Africa from the discourse. Even when talking about multipolarity, hardly anyone imagines the potential of Africa to be a pole in its own right. We talk about possibly US as a pole, China as a pole, maybe Europe, maybe some countries in Asia, but never about Africa. And yet, at the current conjuncture, Africa is becoming a major battlefield of imperialist onslaught. During the old Cold War, if I may call it so, in the bipolar world, Latin America was the backyard of US imperialism, while parts of Asia and the Middle East were the seatbeds of hot wars. In this conjuncture of the new Cold War and contested polarity, both the Cold Wars and the hot wars have shifted to Africa. The contestation between the protagonists of the new Cold War, presumably US and China, and hot wars under the guise of war on terror are raging in Africa, devastating the social fabric and destroying countries. In North Africa, Libya has almost been destroyed. Vijay wrote very good books a couple of years ago on it. In West and Central Africa, Mali is almost destroyed. Niger is on the threshold of destruction. Chad has been in the throes of endemic violence. The next candidate is perhaps Senegal via Mauritania. Meanwhile, Nigeria is submitted to become America's military surrogate in West Africa. In Eastern Africa, Somalia is divided and destroyed. It has yet to get up. Ethiopia is fast degenerating into an ethnic quagmire, providing fertile ground to imperialism to fish in troubled waters. East Africa, which has for long refused to be seduced into war on terror, has all but surrendered. In North Mozambique, where several oil and gas companies like ExxonMobil from the US and Total from France operate, the war on terror is raging, and on and off this spills over into southern Tanzania. If Tanzania has not yet been completely ensnared in the web of war on terror, it is because of its heritage from the era of Mwalimu Nyerere. Mwalimu shunned superpowers during his time like plague. Meanwhile, another military surrogate of US imperialism is in full occupation of North Mozambique, executing the so-called war on terror, but in practice defending the oil and gas companies. Where the stick of war on terror does not easily work, imperialism uses the carrot of trade, aid, and investment to lure these countries into its web, as is happening currently in Tanzania. If the existing trends continue, it won't be long before we see US agribusiness causing havoc with the agriculture systems of my country. Given this scenario, I want to pose a question to all our comrades and my fellow Pan-Africanists. Where would Africa stand in a multipolar world? Is it in a position to create itself into an independent pole in the multipolar world? Or would it willy-nilly be drawn into one or the other North Atlantic, or maybe even the Chinese pole? What class forces and configurations, what agency is required for Africa to be an independent pole in the multipolar world? I have some opinions, but no answers. I'm only posing the question for discussion. And I may just add that currently revisiting Pan-Africanism, rethinking Pan-Africanism is a big debate among African intellectuals. So I'll end by saying that posing the right questions is the first step in the journey of 1,000 miles. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Shivji, and thanks for sparing the time to join us today and sharing those extremely important points. So now we're going to turn to our final speaker in this session, Jenny Clegg. Jenny is a former senior lecturer in Asia Pacific and International Studies at the University of Central Lancashire, and she's Vice President of the Society for Anglo-Chinese Understanding. She's also the author of China's Global Strategy Towards a Multipolar World. Jenny, welcome.
Thanks very much, Kate. And it's a great pleasure to be joining this really challenging discussion about where we're up to in the world. So recent events show we're clearly entering a period of turbulence and change. Biden told us America is back only to withdraw from Afghanistan, giving up that control over Eurasia, which was seen by Brezhnev as so vital for US global primacy. Then, as if to scupper rumors of US demise, Biden unveils a new anti-China alliance, AUKUS, unleashing dangers of nuclear proliferation and a new nuclear arms race. So is the US declining, or is it rather regrouping, restructuring its power base to maintain preponderance over China? US hegemony has prevailed over a complex web of interconnecting and conflicting power relations as major powers readjust relations amongst themselves as well as with the developing world. Operating through consent as well as coercion, the US uses its prime position to uphold overall patterns of power and exploitation. The alternative is multipolarization, driven by the rise of developing countries, together with splits in the imperialist camp, which create spaces for development initiatives. These two processes provide the basis for a counter-hegemonic strategy to narrow the scope of US maneuver and enhance the prospects for peaceful development. Seen historically, the terrain of struggle is shaped by a unipolar-multipolar dynamic as balance shifts between the long-term multipolar trend, beginning with the foundation of the UN, which unleashed anti-colonialism, and US efforts to undermine developing countries on the other hand, while keeping allies on side. The last years of the Vietnam War saw the US on the decline and the Third World as ascendant in demands for a new international economic order. But the US nevertheless revived, albeit after 9 years, with its neoliberal agenda, and developing countries became mired in debt. With the fall of the Soviet Union, the US became the sole superpower, but this was in fact a 5-pole pattern, including the EU, Japan, Russia, and also now China as major powers, with some influence on the world stage. It was some years before the US was ready to seize the unipolar moment, and its intent behind the Iraq War was to establish absolute security through full spectrum dominance, to put the US beyond challenge from any regional competitors. The opposition to the war amongst peoples and states was massive. The UN Security Council was split. However, the counter-hegemonic moment was not sustained for long as US allies fell back into line. Now the unipolar-multipolar dialectic has resolved into a trial of strength between the US as the largest developed country and China as the largest developing country. We see the struggle unfold across the international terrain, region by region, in major power negotiations, the Iran nuclear deal, the 6-party talks on North Korea, both at a stalemate. At the global summit table, as in order to feed the increasing parasitism of the North on the global South, the US bears down on what remains of the rights of development, the special and differentiated treatment in the WTO, the peaceful use of nuclear materials, the common and differentiated responsibilities on climate change, only to encounter China's resistance. See how China held out on global power, on coal power projects, until the US increased commitments on developing country climate finance. And then there are the choke points, Afghanistan linking Eurasia and the South China Sea, where the struggle over US hegemonism may be finally decided, or else we may face a nuclear war over Taiwan. The overall situation has become unmanageable for the US, with China's initiatives like the BRI, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, promoting a multipolar developmentalism. So the US resorts more and more to military strength in order to subordinate China, pursuing coercion at the expense of gaining consent, ready to tear down international agreements, for example, on arms control. From the launch pad of AUKUS, the US aims to future-proof its position of primacy in a new phase of hegemonism after spending too long bogged down in forever wars. Lest it fall behind in the fourth industrial revolution and loses its edge in full spectrum dominance, it's betting the future of its economy on the military-industrial complex, incorporating the growing Indo-Pacific. Now, it remains to be seen how the regional world map may be withdrawn around redrawn around the new militarization and nuclearization. But the situation looks serious, with Australia turned into a new armed camp and opening the door wider for Japan and South Korea to go nuclear. AUKUS marks the moment of transition in the US pivot from Europe to the Indo-Pacific. Twice failing to consult NATO, Biden seems willing to risk alienating allies. The critical question is to what extent other powers, both imperialist and developing, will now question US reliability and choose to loosen ties to follow a new path at once more independent, more cooperative, and more in keeping with the true spirit of the UN Charter. We should not overestimate US decline, nor underestimate its will to resist. At least for the Europeans, to go it alone with their own army would be extremely costly, so they, and even France, will likely return to the fold unless there is an alternative. But this is also a moment of opportunity, with rising public concern over COVID and climate change and a growing awareness of the problems of inequality and the need for international cooperation. China has not been afraid now to seize the time amidst the splits among the US and its allies, with a proposal at the UN for a global development initiative addressing unbalanced development within and between countries as a priority through cooperation. The influence of developing countries has been limited both for objective and subjective reasons, but so will this initiative now strike a chord for unity to strengthen the multipolar trend? That other influential global pole, the international peace movement, is also stirring, shocked by the growing nuclear threat and the US readiness to turn its back on the mess it has created in Afghanistan. Can the international peace movement be united? For all the mobilization against the Iraq war, that counter-hegemonic moment did not prove strong enough to sustain the swings amongst the major powers. The dominance of major powers in world affairs is likely to continue for some time to come. The five-pole pattern will persist, but now it is more evenly balanced, with readjustments between the US and other major powers presenting opportunities. However, without an alternative, we will not be able to take advantage of the situation. Now is the time for the international anti-imperialist movement to take stock of the polarization trend with its uneven development, to read the unipolar multipolar dynamic right with a sober assessment of the strengths and weaknesses of both a hegemonic and counter-hegemonic forces, so as to find our bearings amidst the shifting power balances, to make the most of opportunities and to avoid disasters. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Jenny. And I just have to agree with what Madison said in the chat there. Thank you, Jenny. You always lay it out, and absolutely, particularly if I could just pick up there on what you were saying about the importance of the international peace movement rising to the challenge here, and really understanding the importance of the international nature of the struggle, and us improving and really building on our international solidarity, our cooperation and communication. You know, thinking back as you were there to the big struggle against the war in Iraq, you know, the massive global day of action which took place in February 23rd, February the 3rd? Anyway, whatever, you know when I mean, you know, millions, 100 million or so mobilized globally, you know. The challenge is as big as that or even greater. So we all need to really step up and organise and work together. And this event today is a really important part in that process. So thanks very much to all the marvellous expert panelists in this first section, and I hand the chair back to Vijay to take us into panel 2. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks a lot, Kate. Very important voices there from Jenny, from Issa, from Madison, from Ajamu. I think we're already beginning to dig deep into a very complicated issue, which is to do with the signs of multipolarity and the necessity of the international peace movement to really march more forcefully to prevent conflict and, in fact, confrontation. Before we start the next session, I just want to remind people that the head of the WHO, the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros, a very distinguished African scientist, early last year, in early 2020, put out a slogan, which I hope people take to heart. He said, "We need more collaboration and less confrontation. We need more collaboration and less confrontation." Opening up the second panel, we have the perfect speaker, who's the Secretary General of ALBA TCP, the Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of our Americas. Now, the reason Sacha Llorenti is the perfect speaker is that it seems that ALBA TCP's motto is more collaboration, less confrontation. Sacha was the permanent representative for Bolivia at the United Nations from 2012 to 2019. Sacha, welcome to our webinar.
Thank you very much. Good morning from Caracas. It's a pleasure being with you. I'll try to share a few thoughts with you. I've listened carefully to the previous panelists, and I've learned a great deal from their perspective. I spent, as Vijay was saying, 7 years as the ambassador of Bolivia to the United Nations. I presided the Security Council twice, and also I was vice president of the General Assembly. So I had a close experience to the biggest organization that was made by men and women in order to build a multipolar, multilateral organization. And I remember that I used to ask my colleagues many times, what would happen if we put to a vote the UN Charter today? Not just not the configuration of the organization, not the structure of the Security Council, of the rest of the organs of the UN, but mainly their principles and purposes. What would happen if we put to a vote today the respective principles such as sovereignty, equality among states, self-determination? I don't think that we will adopt the UN Charter today, really. That's a real threat, because the challenges that we are facing are not just national ones, do not have to do with any particular country by itself, but those are common challenges. Some people have already spoken about the climate crisis, the nuclear threat, the disruption of technology in our daily life, but also inequality, and how is it being shown by the pandemic. I believe that the pandemic itself has compacted in a few months political, economic, and social phenomena whose consequences in other circumstances would be experienced in many years. 4.5 million people have died infected by COVID-19. And I think that what we've seen through the lens, through the prism of the pandemic could teach us a lot. We've seen job insecurity, deficits in health systems, inequality, how the North and South relations are really, the United Nations failure to coordinate a collective effort. Vijay was talking about Dr. Pedros, and he complained a great deal about how he wasn't able to join efforts in order to fight the pandemic. Also, the use of unilateral coercive measures as a control and punishment weapon against many people, dozens of countries. The global economic vulnerability and the role of the state itself are some of the issues that clearly magnify under the lens of the pandemic situation. And I just want to make a footnote on the unilateral coercive measures, because those were not just, of course, they were not lifted, but they were used as a weapon. I mean, the pandemic was used in order to strengthen the unilateral coercive measures. So that shows how the United States mainly sees this opportunity, so to speak, but also the failure of the multilateral system. We live, of course, a multidimensional and existential nature of a crisis which is existential, as someone has already pointed out. The life on the planet compels us to create and strengthen all possible means in order to collectively build a common, cross-cutting and inclusive horizon that could enable us to recover our social and political initiative. What we are doing in ALBA, I just want to make this point because I believe it's important. What we are going through in the region of the Americas is I think shows how capitalism works in terms of multilateralism, in its relation to multilateralism. At the same time that capitalism wants to destroy any kind of based or roots organization, I mean unions, associations, feminist groups, or people who fight climate change, anything. Capitalism wants to destroy that. At the same time, they want to destroy any effort for a real multilateral effort or organization. What we've seen in the Americas is that we have the OAS, the Organization of American States, that's ruled and by the United States mainly, and its budget is paid by them and also Europe. So they have a clear agenda, which is to impede integration, to stop any kind of development of a new kind of project. So that's why the OAS is focused on attacking countries such as Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and the OAS was instrumental in the coup d'etat against Bolivia in 2019. That's not an isolated case, because we have to see it in relation to the efforts that many countries on this interest have applied in terms of destroying UNASUR, which was an organization of countries of South America that's been extinguished by now. Also, the paralyzation of the community of Latin American and Caribbean states, CELAC, as is it called in Spanish, it's been stopped for, I mean, it hasn't really moved forward for the past 5 to 6 years. And that's done by design. I mean, it's because the United States wants to stop every effort of union in a region, and I'm sure it works the same way in some other regions. So ALBA TCP, we are, 9 countries belong to this organization. Besides Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, Bolivia, we have Antigua and Barbuda, Dominica, Grenada, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and St. Kitts and Nevis. So 5 of our member states are part of the Eastern Caribbean. And we have clearly stated that we are an anti-imperialist organization because there are few documents that are so anti-imperialist as such as the UN Charter itself and its principles and purposes. So what we've been trying is, of course, to fight against the unilateral coercive measures that are trying to cripple the economies of our member states, and also trying to face the pandemic in a different way. We have built a humanitarian fund for the smaller countries of our alliance to be able to buy vaccines. That was done at the beginning of the year in January, where where countries were using very, very negative ways in order to pursue for vaccines or any other means to combat the pandemic. I'll stop there, but I want to thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you.
That was excellent, Sacha. You raised the most important point. If the UN Charter was put to a vote today, would it pass? I think that's a question that we have to really think about. It's a question that we need to put to countries all around the world today. We're going to move to the leader of the Socialist Party of Zambia, presidential candidate this year in the presidential election, Dr. Fred Mbembe, who was also the very valiant editor of the Zambia Post, and for his struggles to create a democratic media in Zambia, he was named the World Press Freedom Hero in the year 2000. Fred, it's great to have you at the No Cold War platform. Please go ahead.
Hello, can you get me now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. We have had the opportunity to live under a bipolar world and a unipolar world. We used to think living under the bipolar world was dangerous, unsafe. We lived under the threat of war anytime, nuclear weapons. It's worse today living under the unipolar world, dominated by the United States. It's not the first time the world is trying to head towards a multipolar. We have had multipolar experiences before in the history of humanity. Of course, they were also dominated by the spread of capitalism. And they also were dominated by all the vices of capitalism, wars and so on. Today, there is a clear movement, small as it may be, fragile as it may be, towards a multipolar world. The process has started. It's not an easy process. But what we must understand with the epoch we are living under, this one unipolar world we are living under is dominated by one ideology. It's a unipolar world dominated by capitalism. We are not living only under the threat of wars from this hegemony, but also our values, our cultures, the way we live, the way we run our societies is threatened by this domination. As a revolutionary and a leader of a political organization trying to make a revolution in Zambia, a socialist revolution in Zambia, I feel it. The USA today dominates a poor country like Zambia. It participates in its politics. It determines or wants to determine the outcome of the electoral processes. So the threat is not only of wars, but the threat to our entire system of life. The democratic projects, even within the bourgeois context, are also being threatened. The elections that we had in Zambia on the 12th of August had a heavy hand of the United States. Scared of this small project, very, very nascent project, socialist project, they had to make sure that an opposition political party that was on the extreme right wing won the elections. And we were humiliated so that nobody could believe that a socialist project can take food in Africa. Fortunately, our people understood what happened. We still have some credibility in us. But this project, this unipolar project today, this unipolar order that we live under today, carries with it all the vices of capitalism. Greedy, unbridled competition, unbridled consumerism. It is not a system that is anchored on solidarity. It's devoid of human solidarity and undermines human solidarity at a time when human solidarity is so much needed, not only to avoid wars, but also to combat other challenges, global challenges that have got nothing to do with the power of firearms. The coronavirus, for instance. And other offshoots of capitalism. Growing inequality in the world, growing unemployment in the world, growing hunger in the world amid this high production. These are issues that need human solidarity. Even a small movement away from this unipolar world dominated by the United States, the efforts being made by China. Look at the reaction. Look at the hostility they're attracting. But there is a good realization. There's something nice happening in China that we revolutionaries across the world admire. The clarity of their ideas now. Their socialist ideas, clear, giving a confidence to revolutionize all over the world on what they are trying to do on the path to socialism. They are having military bases all over. As Professor Shivji has pointed out, today Africa is the battlefield. Over the last 30 years, we have seen serious attempts by the USA to dominate every little space on Africa militarily. They want to be in the reach of every little conflict in Africa. And by conflict, I mean anything they don't like. If today we are on the verge of winning an election in Zambia, they should be able to stop it if they want. They should be in a position to say to assassinate these leaders. This is the world we are in today. Yes, the multipolar world does not guarantee us peace. We have seen from history but it gives us a much higher opportunity to pursue other areas of human endeavor peacefully, and also even to build a more peaceful world than we are living in. I started by saying we used to think the multipolar world, the bipolar world we lived under was dangerous, but this is much more dangerous today. Every effort must be made to increase the global awareness of the dangers of the order we are living in. The peace movement in the UK and other places needed to increase their activities. That vibrance that we saw in the 80s, late 70s, need to come back. Sorry, my time is up. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Fred. Thanks for those words of really caution in a way. The idea that the bipolar world we thought was worse, and then look at what comes after. The desperation for the planet. As you said, the system undermines global solidarity at a time when human solidarity is needed. It's a beautiful line. We're going to move on now to Michaela Erskog. Michaela is a researcher at Tricontinental Institute for Social Research and part of the No Cold War team. She's also a collective member of Pan-Africanism Today, a very key platform for reviving Pan-Africanism on the continent. Mika, take it away.
Thank you so much, Vijay. Greetings to all of those who have joined us, and special greetings to my esteemed fellow panelists. Really honored to speak alongside you. Like Ajamu, Issa, and others, the question I also raise is what kind of multipolarity we want to build from the perspective of Africa and from the interests of our people. So as a young African woman who was born shortly after the fall of the Soviet Union, I've only ever really known and lived in a world that looks unipolar, a world dominated by US imperialism. And so with no lived experience of an alternative, often it's been history books or the stories passed on from elders like Fred that have previously been the only source of imagining a different balance of forces. Then about a decade ago, when I lived in Mozambique, I took a flight from Maputo International Airport. It was newly expanded and modernized by a Chinese company. With the construction of this humble airport, new vistas emerged for the development of the African continent and for the construction of a world with a different power balance. And then, in a space of a few years, we had the group of 7, the G7 major economies became the G8, we had the G20 emerge, we had BRICS emerge, and we saw developing worlds, the developing world's growing share of global GDP in terms of purchasing power. And again, new possibilities were opening up. The movement towards multipolarity is clearly in full swing, but for our diverse continent, whose historical underdevelopment under colonialism still plagues 1.3 billion people, for us, the politics of that movement, as many people have raised already, the politics of the movement towards multipolarity is at stake. And as Issa was saying, Africa's ability to become its own pole is really what concerns those of us who are working for a different world in Africa. And this is important because I'm sure many of you remember, again, a decade ago, there were many narratives of Africa rising, Africa is emerging. But for most of the continent, that rising was amongst a predatory African elite. Where was the people-centered agenda? Has it ever been there? Those are some of the questions we've been trying to grapple with in Pan-Africanism today. And so I want to talk briefly about a historical moment and then some contemporary efforts. Some months ago, I was visiting Ghana, and during my visit, there was a protest of mostly young people calling out the failures and the corruption of their government. And just a stone's throw away from those protests was the resting place of Kwame Nkrumah, independent Ghana's first leader, who led a coalition of newly independent African states in a fight to build Africa's unity, development, and sovereignty, lifting high a banner of Pan-Africanism that was revolutionary, radical, people-centered. And with leaders like Nkrumah, during the 1960s, Africa really held that promise of lifting up its people. This promise was also strengthened by the fact of their participation in the Socialist bloc within the International Front of the Non-Aligned Movement, which Nkrumah and others had inaugurated. But after Nkrumah's death in 1972, having been pushed out of power a few years before by a US-backed coup, the banner he had hoisted, a banner that held the promise of people-centered development, was torn down, and any kind of radical potential in groups such as the Organization of African Unity, now known as the African Union, any potential for them to provide leadership that could transform the continent, that could allow Africa to develop into a powerhouse on its own terms, went with it. And as many have explained, Western corporations guarded by foreign militaries recaptured the continent and many other parts of the world, and meaningful contributions by China on the continent have been pushed back further and further as the US kind of creates this protracted new Cold War on the continent. But if we're thinking contemporarily, Africans continue to resist, right? Our people will continue to resist. And in the spirit of the Nkrumah moment, in recent years, we've seen African left progressive forces begin to rebuild and experiment in processes that could bring about a people-centered agenda on the continent. One such moment that I just want to mention was inaugurated it was almost exactly 3 years ago in Winneba, Ghana, where on the 20th of September 2018, a delegation of over 400 people from across Africa, the diaspora, and the globe convened the third Pan-Africanism Today conference, which my organization helped to coordinate. This was a continental gathering of various progressive organizations who all also form part of the International People's Assembly, which is a really important international assembly of progressive organizations, grassroots movements from across the globe. And during this meeting, which was represented by 62 countries, we had socialist leaders, peasants, feminists, trade unionists, cultural workers, media workers, and different solidarity groups. The explicit aim of the meeting was, how do we coordinate and activate meaningful processes that could actually advance the unity of African people against capitalism, against imperialism, but from the perspective of our people and from their daily struggles. And unlike the talk shops of state-sponsored gatherings of the UN, of UNESCO, this was the first time a meeting of this kind was convened by leaders who are involved in the day-to-day struggles and challenges of overcoming inequality and injustice. So, as I mentioned, we had the participation of South African metal workers, shack dwellers, Zambian socialists, Tanzanian peasants, Moroccan feminists. And in that constitution marks a really important shift towards forces from below, towards an internationalism and a regional project from below. Some of the important resolutions that I just want to mention before I close is that in terms of the outlook, the meeting committed to developing a concrete socialist program, right? This has been unheard of, that this ragtag group of people would say, we want a socialist agenda because it will build and deepen and consolidate a Pan-African social movement, and it will enable us to struggle meaningfully against imperialism and capitalism. It also raised the importance of raising economic struggles to the level of political struggles, and it committed itself to fighting against capitalist ideology, as Fred was mentioning, which denies class struggle and which denies the validity of people's power from below. And again, I'm sharing all of this today with you all is because African governments today do not represent the interests of the people. It's only when we organize and challenge the status quo from below, within our respective nations, only when we wrest power from the predatory class and constitute governments that pursue a radical agenda that places people over profit, can we meaningfully develop our continent and meaningfully contribute to the movement towards multipolarity. Multipolarity looks inevitable, as many have already mentioned, but what it looks like and how it will unfold is yet to be written. And we on the African continent, we are learning from the regional experiences of Latin America. We're learning from how it's the progressive leadership of Cuba, of Venezuela, that turned the tide for many of the people of Latin America. So to close, for Africa's genuine advancement, we have the task of building resistance to the existing organization of society and building people's power. Only then can we advance a multipolarity from below, a multipolarity in the interest of the working class, the poor, the disenfranchised, the historically oppressed and exploited. And that will, again, not come from our contemporary African governments who, in fact, covered the denigration of our people, but the character of Africa's development and participation in the multipolar world must come from below, organized by our people, for our people.
Excellent, Mika, because that now takes us right back to what Issa said about what is the African project, what is the reconsideration of Pan-Africanism. The future will look like what we put into it now, and that's a very important point. We're going to move on to Professor Radhika Desai, who's the professor of political studies at the University of Manitoba and the director of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group. Radhika, it's up to you now.
Thank you, Vijay, and thanks to my co-panelists. It has been a really fascinating seminar, and I've already learned a great deal. Let me just put a couple of things that I might be referring to in the chat so I'm not distracted later. What I want to do with my few minutes is talk about the advance of multipolarity, or better yet, what Hugo Chavez called pluripolarity. And I want to put that in a very long-term historical context, because if you think about it, the existence of multipolarity began to be recognized certainly after 2008. People began to talk about it more and more. And certainly in the pandemic context, it has been further underlined. So today it has been accepted, and of course, developments such as the United States' ignominious defeat in Afghanistan further underline the decline of US power, and therefore underline the fact that productive power, and what also goes along with it, which is a security power, etc., has spread around the world in a way where the United States can no longer dominate. But at the same time, I would say that this moment also has a prehistory. Remember, there was also Vietnam. The US defeat in Vietnam was ignominious. Remember that in the post-Second World War period, whatever we may have thought about the US power back then, although it was certainly dominant over the capitalist economies of the world, there was absolutely no certainty that it dominated the world as a whole, particularly because large swaths of the world's populations and territories were taken up by communist countries, and we lived in a so-called bipolar world. The United States had wanted, right from the beginning of the 20th century, to emulate the sort of dominance that Britain once had in the 19th century. But I have argued in my book, Geopolitical Economy, I'll just show you the cover there, that by the time the United States came to attempt this, the world had already become too multipolar, too pluripolar for this to be possible. We have not been able to assimilate this and understand this because as I've argued in various writings, our understanding of the world economy, the world order of world affairs is dominated by what we may call cosmopolitan understandings, which thinkers as different as Friedrich List and Antonio Gramsci called cosmopolitan. That is to assume that the whole world is a seamless world economy, whether it is united by markets under free trade and globalization discourses, or whether it is united by a single state under US hegemony and empire discourses. In reality, and what geopolitical economy does is it makes a case against this cosmopolitan understandings and shows that these understandings are actually like the dominant ideas that dominate any society, which are the ideas of the ruling classes. Of course, there is no state at the world level, but the dominant ideas have been so far the ideas of the dominant countries, the ideas that serve their interests. Because what do cosmopolitan ideologies do? They kind of imply that the opening up of subordinate economies to the rest of the world is inevitable, desirable, everything in between, etc. So And of course, they imply that somehow productive power spreads around the world through opening up, whether it's done by markets or by hegemonic states. In reality, there is really very little substance to the idea of hegemony. There is also very little substance to the idea of free trade and globalization. In reality, I have argued that productive power, and alongside with it, the power to generate one's security, has spread around the world through the dialectic of uneven and combined development, where dominant countries seek to preserve the unevenness of capitalist development, where power is concentrated in some countries, productive power, military power, etc., and other countries resist it. They resist it through contender development, combined development. Issa Shivji was asking about, what is the kind of character of the developments that will have to take place before Africa can become a pole of world power. The character of that development is the ability to conduct combined development, whether under capitalist auspices or increasingly, as will now be necessary, under socialist auspices. And that requires a class mobilization. And the thing about geopolitical economy is that it puts class and nation in the same picture, much as Marx and Engels and the classical Marxists did. It goes back to that tradition. So what emerges from this is an idea that by the time the US arrives on the scene, this Johnny-come-lately of imperialism, and wishes to exert power over the world, it is sufficiently powerful to try, but it was never sufficiently powerful to succeed. So that's the narrative in which then multipolarity emerges today as a long-term historical process going back to the 1870s, when the dominance of Britain over the world economy was challenged by the second order industrializers, the chief among whom were the United States, Germany, and Japan. And since that time, what we have seen is not a world of spreading globalization or a world of succession of hegemonies, but rather a world of spreading multipolarity or pluripolarity. Because the reason Chavez liked the idea of pluripolarity was because he saw that not only were there a multitude of poles of power, but in order to get there, each one of these poles of power, whether they were socialist or, whether they were capitalist or after 1917, socialist, after 1917, after 1949, each of them had to build a unique set of state institutions in order to conduct successful combined development, which is what has brought us here. So already by the time of the First World War, the First World War occurred because the world was already multipolar, and this multipolarity, which is entirely salutary, was combined with another reality, the existence at that time or over the previous period of a sufficiently large number of less powerful states or even stateless territories, which these powerful countries could compete to gain control of, which is why you get the First World War and the 30 years crisis of 1914 to 1949 that followed. So basically, and then what you have is successive waves. By after 1917, you already have the USSR, and then after 1949, China conducting socialist combined development, which has also happened elsewhere. The post-war recoveries, the development of the NICs and the BRICS. I'm not saying that they were all, how can you say, socialist paradises, but they still changed the structure of power. Remember, no matter how much the US dominated the world economy in the immediate post-Second World War period, it always had to take account of the fact that the Europeans and the Japanese had sufficiently different interests, and they often could and did plow a line of their own. To take just one example, Germany's Ostpolitik, which then eventually forced the US into various forms of détente. The United States would have dearly loved to extinguish all socialist experiments, but it had to deal with them. So we want to put the present moment in that longer historical context. And when we do that, we also realize that pluripolarity today, and that's where I would like to mention the manifesto that some of us have written, the International Manifesto Group. The manifesto we have written is entitled Through Pluripolarity to Socialism. And I would end with the following thought. Marx and Engels had already anticipated in the late 19th century, that when capitalism reaches its monopoly phase, it is essentially ripe for transition to socialism. That monopoly phase had already definitely been reached by the early 20th century, as many later classical Marxist writers, whether it was Lenin or Hilferding or Bukharin, underlined in their own writings at that time. Interestingly, that maturation, thanks to the dialectic of uneven and combined development, that maturation took its fullest form precisely in the economies that were challenging the UK's hegemony. And these economies were, as the consequence, far more state-directed, protectionist, etc., etc. And these were the ones that were ripe for socialism. So basically what I'm trying to underline is that the pluripolarity that is necessary, the various sorts of state interventions that are necessary to even secure some kind of productive power are also create the necessary groundwork for the building of socialism. And that's how we should see it. So I will end there. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Radhika. Our final speaker is taking us back to Shanghai, and that's Professor Li Bo. Professor Li Bo is with the China Research Institute at Fudan University in the People's Republic of China. He is also a senior fellow at Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. Li Bo, the floor is yours.
Unmute. I forgot to unmute. Okay. Thank you, Vijay. It is the amazing opportunity for me to meet you all by this, and also learned a greater deal of the previous speeches and presentations. I also thank you so engaged to a call for the peace in the world in this very difficult time, especially actually China also need the people to understand China's development, and also to align, we can unite the forces to solve the problem we are facing. So I guess I'm the only one from China, right? So I will come up to some of the previous presenters' thoughts. So, for example, is the American really collapsing? Yeah. So from the most of the China geopolitical thinkers, we see the American is declined. Not, you mentioned the Vietnam retreat is very badly for US, but this time this is much different, the retreat from Afghanistan, because the US already lost their manufacturing base. So by 1970, US is the most productive capacity in the world. So they have their GDP consistent of manufacturing mostly. But now they only have the financial game industry, right? They have the virtual economy. So the manufacturing base is very weak in the US. And even when they launch a war against China, the munition, yeah, and the new the material for the vessel, where they get, yeah. So this is a really, we see this is a weakened US in the world. So this is the beginning for the multipolarity world. And some colleague talked about AUKUS, this new pact between the US and the UK and Australia. And for us, the AUKUS is a retreat move. Actually, you know, there's a two circling chain around China. The first island chain is going from Taiwan up to Japan and South Korea. And the second chain starts with Australia. The US move is actually try to sacrifice the South Korean, Japan, yeah, and make them nuclear power, and then fight with China, but then put their troop back to the Australia. So they calculated that they cannot win the battle when China go over to take back the Taiwan, right? So, but why? Because China's economic power already surpassed the US in the 2014, where the US economist Stiglitz called this the beginning of the China century. And before that, we witnessed the 2008 financial crisis, where the US already showed their true face, right? So they just print the money, and they say they will revise the capitalist model. But in the end, after the 15 years, when we look at today, so they did nothing. So another bubble is actually breeding. So actually, people, hello, you can hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah. So actually, the finance people is also looking. What is next? The bust bump will coming up. Can you hear me?
Yeah, all fine.
Yeah, fine. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So the empire. Okay. The empires in decay is most dangerous enemy. So we agree. So they are looking for enemy, and they found one. This is the China, right? And the China economic power also translated into the military capability. I mentioned in today's lecture for China study, there's the fighting jet, the J-20, with invisible future. So that's make US also nervous. China is the second country capable to do this. And the speed China manufacturing can bring the new marine battle vessel onto the water is also amazing. And China has also innovated the so-called supersonic missile system, where US actually is lag behind. So we say, US, you cannot do, China is ready for fight. And if the US, you cross the red line, and we will fight back. Yeah, so we are prepared to defend our socialist path. And also, when we speak here, a Chinese airplane brought back the Meng Wanzhou, the Huawei's the executives flew her out from the Vancouver after 3 years detention at home, right? So this is a sign. Actually, the U.S. now soften their stance towards China. China will not cut all the ties with the U.S. Why? Because the economic situation between China and the U.S. is still, I will call, coexistence. And the U.S. finance system actually is a parasite. The U.S. dollar system is relying on China economic functioning. That make a lot of return of the China economic boom, and also make a lot of convenient return between the China's trade with other countries. China is #1 trade power, but 90% of the trade has consumption, has transaction in the US dollar, right? So actually, still, although we have this technology war, we have this hybrid war with US, but this Cold War is different than the Cold War with the US and the UdSSR, because the economy and the financial system is so intertwined, yeah. So we say when China released the 2 Canadian spies back to Canada, and then we welcome Meng Wanzhou, Huawei executive in China, we make it a joke. We say this is the first exchange of the war prisoners in this new Cold War. Yeah, those will happen more, must happen more. Many of our friends living in the US, China scholars, engineer, high sophisticated technical people, they have fear they won't go back. They won't go back to China, right? And because the FBI lock their door, right? and then do the harassment to them. Yeah. And okay, so they then they bring another perspective from my side. It's not only China can ready to battle with the US aggression. China is also exporting the most capital actually to the outside world. China is the biggest lender now to the world. And I looked at the figure around the Belt and Road country. The China investment in Latin America already amount $400 billion in the recent 10 years. And 1/5 of Africa infrastructure financed by China. And China provided $200 billion and totally there's estimate there's 2 trillion Belt and Road Initiative investment agreement in the pipeline. Some will be on hold because of the COVID, right? Some on hold because of so-called carbon neutral requirement. So now China move a little bit slower, but this is the big sum, because if we look at the Western, what they provided to the global south, they maybe provided 100 to 200 billion as the so-called ODA, official development aid, right? But this is peanuts, and they even not they not give all this. They put a lot of conditions in that, right? And when in this we are working, we try to also work with the UN agency. VJ also warned me, say, oh, be careful, yeah, there's a different type of the agencies, and this is the reality. We learned this, yeah, within the past months. We see there are some the so-called the international agencies. They are not working in the interest of the people, global south people, and some of the interest agencies under UN is very corrupting. They corrupted the young people with a mental ideal to be the solidarity, but they cannot reach the goal in the multinational institution. So we needed to come up with a new mechanism. I would prefer the local, regional, multilateral institution instead of the UN. Maybe take China, take some of the agency UN to really help. And we needed to create a new philosophy for the development. Yeah, I'm not called a socialist movement now from the grassroots or for the country, because it's not the right time. But we need to do the united front work, right? And then the developing rights is most important for the global south. And China is standing for that. And then Xi Jinping is standing for that. He said, China's voice is always with the global south, with the developing world. But what I'm saying is actually this developing philosophy was already, how can I say, undermined by the multinational, so-called multinational agencies. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. That was superb. A great way to wrap up an extraordinarily powerful webinar. Thanks very much to my co-host, Kate Hudson from the Campaign for Nuclear Development. Thanks to Ajamu Baraka, Jenny Clegg, Madison Tang, Issa Shivji, Sacha Llorenti, Fred Mivembe, Michaela Erskog, Radhika Desai, and Libo. It's been a great pleasure to be with you all. Thanks to Daniel from Tricontinental and Carlos from No Cold War for running the tech on this. The No Cold War team is associated with a statement which you can read at nocoldwar.org. I encourage you not only to read the statement, not only to sign the statement, but to go out there and campaign for the statement. We need you to campaign to end the policy of confrontation and to promote the policy of collaboration. The various presentations will soon be provided by our partners from Bolivia. Causachun News is going to provide clips from the presentations for you to use online. The YouTube channel is, of course, alive and well, and this entire webinar can be seen again on YouTube. Thank you very much, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be with you, and we'll see you again very soon at our next webinar. Thanks a lot.